ORF Sound.
Betrifft Geschichte.
Well, in some ways, the American Revolution was not unlike other revolutions. It's easy for people with different backgrounds, political views, viewpoints on different issues to align themselves and to support a larger cause. And I mean, when you had the 13 colonies, those were really more like 13 distinct sovereign entities, or, they did not see themselves necessarily as Americans. So the revolution changes that. But, those types of rivalries and differences don't immediately fade. And so a big part of what the founding generation then sets out is to expand upon this idea of we are all Americans, we have a shared ideal, a shared culture, and that one way to project that idea is through the building of new public buildings that are supposed to be emblematic of a representative democracy, while at the same time, pulling different things from history, right? A very neoclassical look, very much harkens back to ancient Rome, ancient Greece. You see more sort of that classicalism that's linking the new American experiment to Greek democracy. You also have a lot of contentiousness and disagreement about the size of the buildings, design of the buildings, the materials they're made out of. But you really do have people like Thomas Jefferson and later the Democratic Republicans who are constantly pushing back against the trappings of pomp and circumstance. And they're the ones then who say this flies in the face of the revolution. We fought a war to free ourselves from the aristocracies, from the monarchies. And on the other side, you have Federalists like Alexander Hamilton, who are saying that the United States needs to start projecting itself this way if it's going to be taken seriously. And, to some degree, he's right. The European nations generally don't take the United States very seriously, not until much later. But, to be part of that conversation, obviously, there's still a lot going on in terms of the transatlantic world. The United States is immersed in different economies, whether it's Great Britain or France or Spain or the Caribbean. And Federalists like Hamilton say that the United States needs to project itself as the new Rome, that we are amongst, the major powers of the world. But there's also the side effect of we need our citizens to see ourselves that way as well. And so one way to do that is to do it through design, through buildings, the creation of a new federal city. Peter Charles L'Enfant, he is the one who creates the original plan. Building off of that, to more or less orient it to be almost more like a European capital. And so the idea was that Washington, D.C., the new federal city, would be the next Paris or the next London, a major global city of commerce, culture, politics. But if you came to Washington, D.C. in 1790s, that's not what it would have looked like at all. But it was more about the vision, right? And it took many, many years to make that vision come to life. When Washington becomes president, he takes the oath of office April 30th, 1789, in New York, which is then, at that time, the capital of the United States. There really is no official executive mansion or president's house. Washington will rent two different houses in New York, and these were private residences. And so obviously there are going to be problems with the layout. There may be space issues. It may not have the best orientation. And so then when the capital moves to Philadelphia, Washington will go along with it. He finds the house in Philadelphia a little bit more agreeable. And the owner also allows him to make some modifications and renovations to the house. But, still, it is the home of a private gentleman. Washington is simultaneously serving in a role that, if you look at Article 2 of the United States Constitution, there's really not a whole lot in there about, how should a president act? How often should they be made available to citizens? What is the entertaining and hospitality expectations of the president? There were all these things that Washington had to invent really sort of as he went. And oftentimes he would ask his fellow cabinet members for their opinions on, what they thought was proper. He didn't feel as though he should be treated as he was a monarch. At the same time, he also understood, he couldn't have open office hours. He can't have people coming constantly to interrupt the work of the executive. And so he tries to find sort of a middle ground between those two, specifically talking about his afternoon levees that he would do on Tuesdays, primarily with, more affluent gentlemen. They would gather in a circle around Washington. He would be introduced to each one of them. They would have a few words. And then after he went around the entire circle, that was more or less the ceremony. And then Washington would leave. And at the same time, Washington would, on Fridays, him and Martha would have more male female parties where they would invite people who maybe weren't as affluent, and it was a little bit more open ended. So, between that and then him rotating his dinners with different members of Congress, he didn't want to show favoritism to any one particular member of Congress. Washington thought very carefully about really everything that he did and how it would be perceived. He was keenly aware of it when he was president because, I mean, there was so much to be written about what was proper, what is the correct protocol, what is appropriate for the head of state to do in a new representative republic. But I always sort of like to joke that it was kind of like you gave Washington the opportunity to design his dream house, to build a stone house in the city that would later bear his name in Washington, D.C. If you've ever been to Mount Vernon, which is George Washington's private home in Virginia, he expanded a couple of times himself. When he inherited it, it was a much smaller hunting lodge, a family hunting lodge. And then over time, he expanded on it. It's part of the reason why, if you look at it, it's not as symmetrical with windows and things. And it's because there's staircases in places there shouldn't be. What's interesting about it is that Washington had it painted, used a process called rustification, which more or less makes the wooden exterior look like stone. So if you've seen a photograph of Mount Vernon, it looks like it's made of stone with stone blocks, but that's actually carved wood and it's painted. Now, why is that? Well, because stone is a very expensive building material. And Washington, really doesn't come more into his wealth later in life. At that time, Thomas Jefferson serving as Secretary of State, and he suggests that they hold a design competition. There's a few different reasons for this. I think one, Jefferson is hoping that perhaps that might tip Washington to maybe doing something a little less stately, a little bit more quote unquote American in Jefferson's eyes, which in Jefferson's mind, it would have been a brick house, the house of a gentleman, probably more akin to something like the house he was living in Philadelphia. And Washington seemed to have a decided preference for stone. And so he thought perhaps maybe a design competition would be a good way to get some other ideas. It's better for the American people to feel like they have an opportunity to be part of shaping this American ideal, right? That it's open, there's a contest, we're going to select a winner. And they do the same thing for the Capitol building as well. So they put out those advertisements for a call for plans. And what's really interesting is that the description for the Capitol does have a lot more specificity to it. Like it says the types of like the rooms that they need to have and the sizes, and it's much more specific about how they need to be using that space. And maybe it's just because, we've had a Congress, right? We know how the Congresses have worked in the past. We know the types of spaces they need, but the president's house is very open-ended. And I think it's just a big part of it is they were still trying to figure out exactly what were the needs of the president. And that really it would be up to the president to really sort of determine those things. An Irish-born immigrant named James Hoban, who comes over to the United States earlier. He finds his way to Philadelphia, and he goes down to Charleston, South Carolina, and that's really where he makes his mark in terms of the building trades. He has experience as a mason, as a carpenter, and he's taken on a bit more of design work as a designer and early architect. It's not entirely clear if him and Washington met during Washington's tour of the southern states, but we do know that whether it was there or whether it was through a connection through someone else, Hoban is able to meet with Washington in the summer of 1792. I would imagine he probably showed him some of the designs that he was thinking of. Hoban then gets a letter from Washington that he takes to the commissioners of the district, sort of introducing him as somebody who's interested in being a part of the competition and that he's working on the plans. And I think Washington even says something like, I don't really know him all that well, but it's hard to imagine that he didn't meet with Washington and get a little bit of Washington's feedback on his plan. Because lo and behold, after the design competition is over, who shows up to evaluate the plans but President George Washington in Washington, D.C.? And even though it is the commissioner's decision, they're all appointed by Washington. He's in the room. So to me, it's not that surprising that they select James Hoban in his design. Now, what's interesting about Hoban's plan is the White House that was built differed from what Hoban originally proposed. If you look at L'Enfant's plan for the city, when he had generated sort of the layout of that, what is today President's Park, He was envisioning more like a presidential palace. It was going to be much larger in terms of the scale when you look at the city grid. That ultimately doesn't get built. Now, Hoban's plan actually did have a whole nother story to it, and it also had the porticos to it. So it would have been even bigger than it was. But like many other things, they start construction, costs go over, and decisions are then made about how do we keep costs in line, keep construction moving. And what they decide is they're going to remove one of the stories and they're going to take off those famous porticos. And so when Hoban's White House is completed, it really only appears as a two-story stone house with no porticos. And then those are added on later by future presidents. There's a number of different major renovations and rebuilds after the fire in 1814. Washington didn't live in the house. He's the only president who didn't live in the house. He likely does visit the construction site on his way back to Mount Vernon after he retires from the presidency. He also owns a little bit of property in Washington, D.C. In fact, he has another private home built in Washington, D.C. So I would imagine he encountered the house, but he dies in 1799, so he doesn't actually attend an official function there. John Adams doesn't move in until the following year. But it really is hard to imagine that, the White House is designed the way it is, or it even gets built the way it gets built without George Washington. We often say that it's very representative of the paradox that the United States, founded on the ideals of liberty, equality, democracy, while at the same time building these massive structures with the abundance of enslaved labor. It's not so much unlike to anytime we're talking about the founders or the signers of the Declaration of Independence, who they themselves were signing a document to declare freedom and to throw off the yoke of economic slavery from Great Britain while simultaneously holding their fellow man in bondage. That paradox also applies in the New Republic. The Constitution does not outlaw slavery. It continues, shifts, and evolves a little bit. By and large, slavery continues within this new federal government. And when it's decided that they're going to place the new federal city here along the banks of the Potomac River, I mean, the land was Virginia and Maryland, and those were both states that already permitted slavery. It was quite a while before Washington, D.C. becomes this global city, a metropolis. That's much more of a 20th century evolution. I mean, in the 19th century, often what you had, people arrived to Washington, D.C., they're really sort of shocked. This is the capital of a supposedly powerful nation state, a global player. And for many people, what it looks like is it looks more like farmland. You kind of see sort of a scattering of buildings. It's sort of sparsely settled. You're able to identify the White House and the Capitol because they are the largest buildings by far. There's not really anything else around. So beyond that, it's smaller brick homes, wooden homes. It actually kind of probably would have looked almost more like a frontier town of sorts to some people. Because those massive public buildings projects were built here, first the federal government had to buy up the land from those property owners, which, they were able to do fairly quickly. There were some that held out as long as possible so they could try to get more money from the government. And then after they do that, it was sort of turning their attention to the construction projects. Then you start to look around and, this is not a populated city, right? You're not building a president's house in Boston. You're not building a president's house in Philadelphia. You're building a president's house in what is more or less a very desolate, remote location. When the commissioners are sort of struggling to find laborers to get, especially wage earners, to come down here because, well, A, business is good in those other cities. There's plenty of projects. B, do you really want to move all the way across country to a place that may not even have housing or accommodations or provisions or anything that you might need, particularly if you had a family? And then C, do you trust the new federal government to pay you what is owed for your work? Because, that was also an issue that's been an issue going back to the revolution where, Congress struggles to make payments on things. Ultimately, what ends up happening is the commissioners start relying more and more on enslaved labor because, it's abundant, right? There were formerly plantations filled with enslaved laborers who were working the farmlands primarily for tobacco. It's a very labor intensive crop. You're going to need a lot of enslaved people to plant and to harvest. But if you sort of take those lands away, you have slave owners who continue to still hold enslaved people in bondage, but now they're starting to look for other projects that they could hire them out on and collect the wages. And so it was just sort of, the circumstances of how things unfolded, building in a place that permitted slavery. There wasn't really a population here, to begin with. They are able to recruit, other workers like craftsmen. So you get stonemasons, stone cutters. But, there's also evidence that we found through the initiative that there were enslaved sawyers, carpenters. So it wasn't just, enslaved people doing sort of the hard labor tasks. There were also some enslaved people who already had those skills. And so what you get building the White House between 1792 and 1800 is this mix of enslaved, free, white, black, immigrant, local. It's just a very diverse mix of different people, some who are there by choice, some who are forced to be there. And we know that right outside of the White House, just north of the White House, what is today Lafayette Park, that was really the primary construction site. So you would have had the brick kilns, fired up, grading bricks around the clock. Like some of the wood came from Virginia, so that was where it was harvested and it was brought over. A lot of the stone itself came from the quarries down near Aquia Creek in Stafford County. There was one quarry in particular called Government Island. It was an experiment the government tried where they purchased a quarry from a local quarry owner, and they thought that maybe they could just run the quarry themselves to get all the stone they needed for these projects. But what they learned pretty quickly was it wasn't as simple as it sounded. And eventually they turn over the operations of the quarry to a private individual to run it for them. There's been some great research on how the stone quarriers, they were working almost like an association of sorts, and they weren't as helpful in terms of labor. They weren't as helpful in terms of hiring workers. They weren't as helpful in terms of transportation. And so it's a very interesting example to think about even today when we talk about things like government interference with local affairs and how this particular group of couriers were able to more or less band together to sort of protect their local industry. But we do know that there was, based on sort of the payment records, who was being paid for the stone, there were quite a few quarry owners from Stafford County. So it wasn't just Government Island, but they were also getting stone from quite a few of those property owners. You would have had these wooden sheds for workers. Sounds like the enslaved workers who were brought from the outskirts outside of DC to work here. I mean, they were not going back and forth, so they were more or less staying, and they would be working long hours, harder to work in the winter months. They would really try to get as much labor out of them as they could during the prime construction season. We know that enslaved labor was really sort of part of every piece of the process to put the White House together. When John Adams moves in, he says to Abigail in a letter that it is in a state to be habitable, which is not very high praise. And Abigail was probably pretty surprised when she arrived after John and she saw that there were only a few rooms that were completely finished. They hadn't completed the main staircase going up to the second floor, so they had to actually take the servants' staircase up to the second floor. They burned all the firewood they were allotted to help dry the plaster. I mean, I think the president's house was unfinished. The Adamses only lived there for about 4 months. Jefferson will be there for 8 years, so he's probably the first president to do quite a bit of work to try to make the White House a little bit more furnished, a little bit more complete. And I would say by the time you get to James Madison and the War of 1812, I think the house is further along. They still hadn't finished the East Room by that time. The East Room was left unfurnished. It was primarily used sort of like a multi-purpose space for storage. It wasn't really used in the way it is today. It's not until Andrew Jackson's presidency that that room actually gets fully furnished and outfitted and decorated. And so I would say, really from Andrew Jackson's presidency onward, that's when you start to see the White House as a fully furnished, completely finished space. That includes the porticos. Jackson adds one of the porticos. Monroe adds one of the other porticos. So the White House, as you and I may recognize it today, and how presidents use it, for the purposes that they use it for today, probably doesn't start until about Andrew Jackson. Prior to that, they kind of just made use of the rooms however they saw fit. So, for example, even though there was a separate dining room, like the state dining room, Jefferson preferred to use that space as his office. He used the green room as his dining room. I think Adams used the Red Room as more like a breakfast parlor. So, I mean, those early presidents, because it was more or less unfinished, I think it was much more at their discretion of how they wanted to use the spaces and how they wanted to, have people move through the spaces and how they wanted to meet with people. But once you get a little bit later on, that's where you really start to see the house more or less set in its ways. And what I mean by that is, the East Room, it is the big entertaining space. If you're having receptions, if you're having balls, if you're having weddings or funerals or any kind of big event, that's really sort of where that's taken place. The Blue Room has always been the most formal of the receiving parlors. That's been used to receive guests, whether it's citizens or visiting dignitaries, heads of government. That's been treated more or less as the most formal of the receiving parlors. Red and green have been used for different purposes. I would say that as we get further along, first families tend to use those rooms less and less. They tend to use the upstairs more. But that's not really the case until you get to the 1902 Theodore Roosevelt renovation. And in that renovation, just as a very brief background, there was no West Wing, there was no East Wing. There were the colonnades, and they were more or less service wings. The East Colonnade gets demolished late 1860s. And so even going up to Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, there were different attempts to try to either build a new president's house or to greatly expand or renovate that White House and add on to the White House. There's a plan that's put forward by Caroline Harrison, First Lady, with Benjamin Harrison, to add wings and also add a new conservatory to the south. It would have more or less enclosed the grounds. It doesn't go anywhere because, with any of these projects, you need friends on the Hill. You need people who are going to appropriate the money. I think it also helps to be a popular president. It also helps to make sure that the economy is doing well. You don't want to propose those kind of things, when you're fighting off inflation or a panic or any kind of economic crisis. So that doesn't happen. Theodore Roosevelt is the one who's able to make this renovation. Part of it is because he has friends on the Hill. He's a popular president. He has 6 children. So, if there's a case to be made that the White House is too small, they have kids sharing rooms, they don't even have enough rooms for guests, and the president needs a larger workspace. I think the argument holds pretty well for him. There were, of course, people that were upset that he had the greenhouses and the conservatory dismantled and moved elsewhere. There was also people who were unhappy that they had to meet with him in his executive office instead of the White House. But it's part of the building sort of evolving and changing. And, it has to more or less run a parallel track to the presidency is changing. The needs of the presidency are changing. The needs of the president's workforce are changing. And so how do you try to reconcile keeping and preserving this icon, this symbol, while also trying to accommodate the needs of the office? Theodore Roosevelt builds the first West Wing. He does not have an oval-shaped office, but it's his successor, William Howard Taft, who comes in. And one of the things he does his first year in office is he expands the West Wing and he adds this oval-shaped office more or less to sort of the center of the office towards the south. And the inspiration comes from the oval-shaped rooms in the White House. And Nathan Wyeth, who's the architect who works with Taft, they draw that inspiration of using those oval-shaped spaces as, again, sort of connecting with Washington and oval-shaped spaces, how Washington was trying to be accessible, but also that I think Taft thinks it's more efficient to have an oval-shaped office because it's kind of like anybody can access the president at any time. There are multiple doors into the hallway as opposed to like having just one person be more or less a doorkeeper. And to have the Oval Office move to the center, it kind of means when you look at the floor plan that he's sort of the heart, right? He's kind of like at the middle of the activity. So at a moment's notice, anybody can reach the president, which could be a good thing, could be a bad thing. Even though they built that brand new West Wing, they probably outgrew it by the time Roosevelt's presidency was over. The fact that Taft wanted to expand it almost immediately, it gets expanded again during Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, 1934. And when that happens is when Franklin Roosevelt moves the Oval Office to its current location, which is the southeast corner of the wing, overlooking what is today the Rose Garden. And so it's been in that place ever since. There was another renovation, a big renovation done during the Nixon administration, 1969, 1970. But by and large, the Oval Office has stayed in that same place. And I think When Theodore Roosevelt did his renovation, there was some dissatisfaction with people having to settle for a meeting with the president in what they were calling it was the temporary executive office. So they didn't know how long it was going to be there. It didn't have the history, it didn't have the nostalgia, it didn't have the historical ethos or environs of the White House. And so sometimes Roosevelt will work in the White House in his private study, and he'll meet with people in his private study. Now, over time, that space in the West Wing becomes that place. And I think a big part of it is just because more and more presidents start working in that space more often. They generally start to make more of a separation between the public and private. Nowadays, I would say very few people go up to the private quarters. It is more or less sort of the friends and family. If you have a state dinner, maybe you're upstairs with your honored guest, but by and large, it's kept a pretty small circle of people who are going up there. And so I think it was hard for the American people to reorient themselves to they no longer have access to that upstairs. That's just for the first family. The president works over here. But eventually, over time, just more and more presidents did official business there. They did events there. It became one of the most photographed spaces. It started to develop this allure in and of itself where to be invited to the Oval Office is now like it's such an incredible honor. You get to meet the president, there's a photo. And even today, when people tour the White House, I often hear like, oh, I want to see the Oval Office. It's not on the public tour, but that has become a space that I think so many people associate with the presidency. They associate with the power of the office. They might be surprised if they actually stepped into it. It's much smaller than it looks. For me personally, it's just this place where there's been so many different moments, events, people. It really has been, in many ways, a place of both continuity and change. You can find larger touch points to the American story in it. Sometimes you can see the White House as almost like a mirror, sort of reflecting back society values, politics, cultural differences. I just think it's a fascinating lens to studying the American past. But then as you're thinking more broadly about sort of the ideals, right, that the United States is grounded in and that other countries have followed, post the American Revolution for the first 100 years, with the exception of moments of national crisis. So, for example, like the Civil War, the White House and the White House grounds were pretty much open to anyone. You could wander onto the South grounds. There were concerts. It was treated almost more like a public park on the South side. So people had a lot more access to the House. And if you wanted to meet with the president, I mean, you would just show up at the north door. There was typically an usher or a doorkeeper who was there, to more or less serve as a form of early security. But, they were not modern day Secret Service. They were not Metropolitan Police Force. And so security has always been a struggle because I think they've started with the idea that they wanted this building to be as open and as accessible as possible. But then you fast forward, and by the time you get to 1901, there's been 3 presidents assassinated. Okay, so obviously we need to do a better job protecting presidents. Well, that's going to extend to where the president spends most of their time, right? And you start to see the gradual closing off of the grounds. You start to see, after William McKinley's assassination, the United States Secret Service is assigned the full-time protected detail. Prior to that, they were really more focused on counterfeiting and other crimes in the Treasury Department. And so over time, they are given that sole priority from Congress. They've expanded the portfolio, right? Now it's protection of the first family, it's protection of the vice president and their family, it's protection of visiting dignitaries, protection of presidential candidates. I mean, so the Secret Service portfolio has continued to expand and expand and expand. And obviously, we faced different types of threats in the 20th century. So, with things like beyond sort of political actors and assassinations and violence, I mean, there's also things like the terrorist attacks, the bombings, Oklahoma City bombing. After that, they closed off Pennsylvania Avenue in front of the White House. It has been open since. There's 2 roads that run on either side of the White House. There's East Executive Avenue and West Executive Avenue. One was closed during World War II. One was closed after the bombing in Beirut during the Reagan presidency. You start to see this protection of the White House and sort of this buffer zone getting bigger and bigger and bigger, And then probably the biggest project, which actually started under the Obama presidency, I think they finished it during the Biden presidency, was they completely replaced the entire fencing around the 18 acres of the White House. The fencing before that was about 6.5 feet. The fencing that currently is up is about 13 feet tall. I mean, it's noticeably taller, but it went through all the different approval processes so that the design would look more historical. It would look like it fit better with the White House. But nonetheless, they kept having issues with people scaling the fence, trying to access the house. It is an unfortunate consequence of just other, individual actor decisions, world events, but it's really sort of forced the White House to become a much more secure place. Harry Truman, like when he joked, he would call it the Great White Jail. that was that was his way. He felt like he was sort of cooped up, he was locked up. And, he wasn't the only president to sort of complain about the precautions and the security measures that are taken in order to protect the president. But, that's the mission that the Secret Service has. And, that also applies to the House. I've always seen the White House as a place of both continuity and change. And I think the continuity you can find is, really in the people who work there. Those are the ushers, the curators who are responsible primarily for the preservation of the collection, the artwork, the fine and decorative arts, the museum character of the rooms, the chief usher also involved with that process, the National Park Service also involved with that process. And so you have this continuity because, presidents and first families come and go. And these career government workers are going to be there safeguarding and ensuring that these things are maintained and preserved for future generations and for posterity's sake. At the same time, every first family is different. They come in with their own opinions, ideas, preferences, aesthetic tastes. I would say that historically, that tends to be a bigger thing on the second floor, which is the private quarters. You can see, like, for example, from the Obama presidency, the Obamas were really high on more modern aesthetics, modern artwork. The second floor really reflected that they wanted their modern taste to really come through. But they didn't change a whole lot on the state floor because that's the floor that people see on tours. It's more or less become accepted as more, kind of like a museum, right? People make their tours, they walk through the space, they see art, they see furniture, they see these things that have historical connections to presidents and first ladies, first families. And yes, they do also doubly use the space for events and programs and things like that. And it is one of the things that makes the White House truly unique as an accredited museum is that their collection is still in active use. That is not something that other museums can say, that people are continuing to maybe say eat off state services, or people are drinking from the same glassware, or they're sitting on the furniture that's, from the early 19th century. So it tries to be all of these different things so that everybody can feel some connection to it. There's obviously going to be some times where, for example, maybe the curators feel strongly that this should be done this way. But if the president or first lady feels like it should be done that way, you try to make it work as best as you can, because ultimately, at the end of the day, the resident staff's priority is the first family. So they have to balance that with knowing that they are temporary residents, right? So they are really the unsung heroes behind the scenes at the White House. They are the ones who ensure that the house is maintained and the collection is pristine, and that any additional conservation or restoration work that needs to be done is done. And, we're excited to partner with them to help raise awareness and support that and fund that, because these are all things that also that, the government wouldn't fund. The government wouldn't set aside appropriations for these types of works of historic preservation. So, it's part of our mission since we were founded in 1961. And the other part is just to educate people about the history of the White House, how it's evolved and changed over time, how it can serve this duality of a place of both continuity and change. Why does preserving it matter? Why does that symbol mean so much to so many people? And I think because, it's been standing, it's been occupied since 1800, it's played such a momentous role, and it served as the backdrop for so many key moments in American history. It's just such a central part of our national story. And so I can see how people then see it changing or see it evolving, and it can be jarring, it can be shocking. But, the White House is still there today. It endures. I think as long as we have these amazing people working behind the scenes, it will continue to endure.